Welcome everybody to the SRA webinar series. This webinar, as we do with all of our webinars, is being recorded and then they're hosted on the SRA website where they're accessible to all SRA members. Please check that out. If you're not a member, check out the joining section of the website and it'll talk about some of the benefits of being a member. If you are a member, be on the lookout for information about our upcoming annual meeting, which will be in December in Arlington. And if you're not a member, take a look at the website. There's a bunch of information up there about what's going on with SRA and our upcoming meeting, etc. So for today's webinar, we have game theoretic and reliability methods in counterterrorism and security. Our presenter is Dr. Vicki Beer. Vicki holds a joint appointment as a professor in the Department of Industrial and Systems Engineering and the Department of Engineering Physics at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. So Vicki, take it away.
All right, thank you, Brett. So first of all, I just wanted to say thank you to everybody for tuning in. It looks like there's kind of a wide range of backgrounds of people on this call. So in deciding how to pitch this, I am assuming that most of the people on the call are knowledgeable about some area of risk analysis, but not about Homeland Security in particular. So I'm going to pitch this at a pretty introductory overview kind of level. I know that there's a few people participating who probably know as much about this or more than I do in some areas. So I will apologize in advance. I hope those of you who are in that situation learn a few new things, but I wanted to make sure this was accessible for the whole audience. So in fact, I decided against having any equations. Those of you who are interested, there's some references here and there that you can keep track of to get more detail on the math. Also, I wanted to say that most of this work was sponsored by Department of Homeland Security at the CREATE Center at University of Southern California. CREATE stands for the Center for Risk and Economic Analysis of Terrorism Events. So that's why USC is on the background, even though I'm at University of Wisconsin.
So Vicki, I forgot to do one thing in the beginning, and that is we really encourage and invite questions. So please, if you have any during the webinar, type them into the questions section of your GoToWebinar control panel, and I'll be monitoring those. And we'll, if they're germane in the middle, we'll bring them up. Otherwise, we'll answer them all at the end. So please don't hesitate to put questions in there.
Excellent, thank you. So I'm going to start with some background about kind of the early days of Homeland Security funding in the immediate aftermath of September 11th and why it is so important for Homeland Security funding to be risk-based or risk-informed. So in the very early days after September 11th, Homeland Security funding was widely criticized as being essentially too pork barrel oriented. So for example, you have people like Stephen Flynn commenting that states like Wyoming were getting more per capita in terrorism grants than New York. Blowing off New York and LA so that you can keep Wyoming safe makes no sense. An official from a rural county in the state of Washington was saying, we're getting stuff we won't use, like hazmat suits for use in case of a chemical attack or whatever, and saying, you know, this equipment really should have gone to Seattle where they might have a potential need for it. And in the early days, again, skewed funding priorities like that were widespread. In fact, the federal formula guaranteed that every state would get 0.75% of the total amount available in grant funding. So 37.5% of the total funding was spoken for without regard to risk or need for funding. And some states also followed the same kind of equal division. If you can kind of imagine that a state got a big chunk of money from DHS, but had not yet set up mechanisms for deciding how to allocate it, taking proposals from cities and counties, etc. So some states also just divvied up their allocation equally between every county. And again, if you can imagine, this means that a small rural county in, say, California or state of Washington got money that they really had no need for, and big urban areas like LA or San Francisco did not get adequate funding for what they needed. Ben Zicker, an economist who at that time was at Rand, used the idea of efficient pork to say that maybe those kinds of subsidies were necessary essentially to sort of grease the wheels of government. That if you want the Wyoming senators and the Wisconsin senators to support big allocations of funding to, say, New York and California, maybe you need to give them a little something to get them to go along with the overall funding program. But Alexia Brunette, who at that time was a postdoc with the CREATE Center, did some background research and found that 0.75% was larger than the minimum amounts in most other federal grant programs. So, for example, highway funding was also done with a similar program where each state gets a certain amount, and then above and beyond that, states get more depending on their need, but the amount was quite a bit less than 0.75%. So this kind of suggests what goes wrong if Homeland Security funding is not sufficiently risk-based in its priorities. Another early kind of failed mechanism, DHS started a process by which, DHS's Department of Homeland Security, by the way, they started a process by which instead of funding just at the state level, funds could be allocated for protection of certain key facilities. So most people probably know the icons shown on this slide. These are Statue of Liberty, Empire State Building, Times Square, and the Brooklyn Bridge, back when the Twin Towers were still standing in the background there. Turns out none of these were chosen as icons when DHS went through this funding priority process. To give an illustration of some of the icons that were chosen as deserving of DHS funding, probably everyone can recognize the St. Louis Arch at the bottom. That's clearly an icon, but probably not as important nationally of an icon as the Statue of Liberty. Some of the other icons on this picture are a bit more obscure. So the one at the top is not the Rose Bowl, it's the Alltel Stadium in Jacksonville. So if you live in the Jacksonville area, that's probably pretty important regionally. I'm not sure it rises to the level of a national icon. Churchill Downs may be a little bit more iconic. Offutt Air Force Base in Oklahoma in the lower right, I assume that it has a lot of important military functions, but it's not exactly iconic. It looks like a flat patch of dirt, basically. So I can understand why it might need protection for its military value, but maybe not for its iconic value. I cheated a little bit on the photo on the upper right. Wisconsin's application to this prioritization process listed 2 historic breweries in Milwaukee as being iconic for the state of Wisconsin. And I don't know which historic breweries were listed, so this is just a photograph of some historic brewery in Milwaukee. Not sure if it's one of the ones that made the priority list. But again, if DHS is allocating funding for protection of Alltel Stadium and a historic brewery in Milwaukee, but not Statue of Liberty, that's a sign that something went wrong with their prioritization process. Again, it was not really sufficiently risk-based. And as you can imagine, there was a lot of outcry from New York. One of the New York papers published a headline that read, DHS to New York drop dead. So Secretary Chertoff, who was then Secretary of Homeland Security, had to write a letter to the New York Times explaining that New York was still #1 in everybody's hearts and minds, and explaining a little bit more about the process that was used. So he pointed out that significant landmarks like the Empire State Building and the Brooklyn Bridge were included as deserving of funding, just not as icons. Why not? Because the Empire State Building got more funding if it was considered a large office building than as an icon. And similarly, the Brooklyn Bridge got more funding if it was considered a bridge rather than an icon. He never did answer the question of what about the Statue of Liberty in Times Square, so I'm guessing that those did not make the list of icons. Going into more detail about this, he said that, gee, the Homeland Security Department tried to be objective and apolitical. They had representatives from state and local emergency management agencies around the country review the applications for funding under this program. And at the end of the day, 96% of the agencies agreed that the panels were representative, and 83% thought that the process resulted in good outcomes. I'm assuming that the New York participants did not quite fall into that 83% who thought that the outcomes were reasonable. So if you look at this situation, if you were responsible for helping to roll out a program that resulted in your boss's boss's boss having to write a letter to the New York Times explaining why things were done the way they were, that could be kind of career limiting, and is again an example of why decision-making that is not risk-based can lead to some problematic results. One example of a program that was put in place early on, I believe in 2004, to try to address this problem is the Urban Area Security Initiative. So this was designed to give funding to major cities that clearly had a different level of terrorism threat than the rest of the country, rather than just divvying everything out state by state. So the initial list of UASI cities was 7, but again, thanks to various pressures, including pork barrel politics, the list eventually grew to 80 cities, at which point places like Columbus, Ohio had made the list. And okay, again, I understand that Columbus is regionally an important city if you happen to live in the Ohio area, but I don't think it would make anybody's list of top terrorism targets unless you happen to have a homegrown extremist in that area. So again, over time, DHS kind of learned from experience and scaled back the number of cities eligible for UASI funding. At one point, it was scaled back to 28. I think it's now up to about 31. And you'll see in a little bit how this plays out. I think the results are much more reasonable now. The UASI process is designed to focus on 3 primary variables. One is consequence. How bad could an attack be? So, for example, an attack in New York City is likely to cause more property damage than an attack in, say, Las Vegas, just because property is more valuable. Vulnerability, how likely is it that an attack would succeed? And threat, is there any reason to believe that somebody wants to launch that type of an attack? And a number of other factors have also been considered over time. Here's someplace where I need to apologize for any DHS knowledgeable folks on the line, because the program changes year to year, so some of these might be a little bit outdated. But for example, a city could rise up in priority if it is at or near an international border or coastline, where it might be easier to launch an attack. Both high population and population density are taken into account as making certain cities more attractive. What critical infrastructure is located nearby? Mutual aid cooperation. If a metropolitan area has mutual aid agreements in place between the major city and outlying areas, that can help a city's application by ensuring that any funding they receive is likely to be beneficially used. And finally, the result of law enforcement investigations and enforcement. Essentially, this is chatter. Does law enforcement believe that there is a major or significant threat against a certain urban area? So, as you can see by kind of the outline of the UASI, we'll get into more detail on what it does later. It's trying to be much more risk-based in its funding priorities. So what do we mean by risk-based preparedness? At a minimum, we should really be taking attacker behavior into account. Intelligent and adaptable adversaries can adopt different strategies after they observe or infer what protective measures we may have in place. If we harden all of the buildings in San Francisco against earthquakes, the earthquakes can't really pick up and move to Houston. They are wherever they are. But a terrorist can certainly choose a different target or a different attack strategy as they observe what defenses we have put in place. And game theory provides a way of accounting for that. So the basic idea of game theory is to determine the optimal defense against an optimal attack. Again, if there's any game theory experts in the audience, that's a little bit oversimplified, but that gives kind of the basic idea. And this makes it useful for security and critical infrastructure protection, because if we're protecting against intelligent and adaptable adversaries, we want to make sure that our defenses account for likely attacker behavior. So the overall goal of game theoretic security analysis is to study the optimal allocation of resources for protecting systems against intentional attacks. There's two basic ways that this can be formulated. We can formulate security as a game between an attacker and a defender, or as a game between multiple defenders. I'm going to talk mostly about the former, about attacker-defender games, but if you want to get a quick idea of a game between defenders, for example, if I put in a home protection system, that may reduce my risk of my house getting burglarized, but it may increase the risk of burglary for my neighbors if any burglars go there. And that's an example of a defender-defender game where the different houses on the block are in some sense playing with or against each other. So there are people who have looked extensively at defender-defender games, but again, I'm going to focus mainly on attacker-defender games. So Here's where the reliability aspect comes in. Much of what we want to protect is not individual assets like, say, the Empire State Building, but systems or complex facilities that perform certain functions. And here it matters a lot how those systems are structured. In the top case of parallel systems, you can imagine that we might be trying to get, say, water or electricity or whatever from the left-hand side of that picture to the right-hand side. In a parallel system, any component can perform that function. That means the attacker has to disable all of the components in the system in order to succeed. And it also means that as defenders, we can pick and choose which components to defend. So if one of the components in this system is easier to protect or less expensive to protect, we can focus our efforts there and have a more cost-effective defense. By contrast, in the bottom picture, again, if you think about getting water or electricity or something through from the left to the right, in the bottom picture of a series system, the attacker has a wide choice of targets. The attacker can disable any one component of the system and prevent its function. And the defender has to protect all of the components, even if some of them are difficult or costly to protect. So this is a problem, especially since many of the systems we want to protect are essentially in series. Some of those are physically in series. For example, pipelines, electricity lines, railway lines, highways are long series systems where an attacker could target any part of the system, and if we want to protect it, we have to protect all parts. Even more serious, though, is that any system with multiple failure modes is conceptually in series, even if it isn't physically laid out in a long line. So, for example, if there are multiple points of entry to an airport or some other secure facility, again, the bad guy only needs to find one point of entry that they can take advantage of, and the defender has to protect all the points of entry. So this is part of why security is typically more difficult and more costly than just the more usual kinds of safety investments that we think about protecting against accidents or acts of nature, because the attacker can see and react to our defenses. Oops, sorry about that. Let's move on. So one advantage of game theory for security is that it is conservative in the sense of being kind of cautious or prudent, even if we don't know for sure that the attacker is going to launch an optimal attack. To illustrate this, let's think about the problem of computer security. So let's say you're Amazon or Barnes and Noble or whoever and trying to protect your computer servers. In deciding which servers to protect, it makes sense to think about, okay, which ones would be the most damaging if they were compromised? Maybe that's the servers that house the customer credit card information. We don't necessarily know that that's the server that an attacker will plan to target. Maybe you have a disgruntled employee or ex-employee who wants to disable, let's say, the Roxanne server just because Roxanne is the name of the girlfriend who broke up with him a week ago. If we knew about that, we would obviously want to protect the Roxanne server, but realistically, there may be no way we could ever identify those kind of idiosyncratic threats. And so it makes sense, if we don't know what the attacker will do, to protect against the worst that an attacker could do. More realistically, though, in the real world, a risk-based decision maker probably also wants to hedge their bets a little bit. Just as an example, in the US, we might agree that a smallpox attack would be the single most devastating type of terrorist attack possible, but that doesn't mean that the US should invest only in defense from smallpox, no matter how devastating smallpox might be, because we are concerned about our uncertainties. Maybe the bad guys can't get access to smallpox. Maybe they don't want to use smallpox. So we want a risk-based method that allows us to capture our uncertainty about the attacker's goals and motivations. So that's part of what we mean by risk-based preparedness in the real world. In addition, defenders may not have the same target valuations as attackers. For example, we may care mainly about, say, preventing loss of life, preventing economic damage, etc., but attackers may care about the propaganda value of the target. For example, they may want a widely recognized target like, say, the Golden Gate Bridge or the Cinderella Castle at Disneyland, just because people around the world would recognize it, even if some other target might cause more damage. They probably also care about the cost or difficulty of the attack strategy for them. Does it require a lot of resources, a lot of funding, a lot of people, a lot of expertise? And so ideally, we would like to take those kinds of considerations into account also in our funding priorities. And recent work over the years since September 11th has gradually gotten more and more sophisticated about that. Note that this has certain implications. If we assume that attackers choose targets based on, say, the expected value of an attack according to their value judgments, undefended locations may not be attacked. You may have a strip mall near your house that has very little security in place. Doesn't mean somebody is going to go target that, because they may have other preferences leading them to focus on more important targets. Likewise, if we as the defender increase the resources allocated to one location, that makes it more likely that the attacker will target some other location instead. So if you look at some of the work that I did, the citation from risk analysis is at the bottom of the screen about a decade ago. If the values of the various targets in a system are sufficiently different, then the lower value targets may be quite unlikely to be attacked, and defenses should be allocated only or mainly to the more valuable targets. And this is true even if we have significant uncertainty about the attacker's goals. So, for example, we may not know whether the attacker considers Boston more attractive than Philadelphia or Seattle more attractive than Newark, but we pretty much know that probably New York is higher on their priority list than Seattle. This means it can be optimal to leave some targets undefended or much less heavily defended. That's true particularly when the defender is highly budget constrained and the values of the targets differ widely. But of course, that's exactly the situation we're in the real world. We don't have unlimited budget, and we have literally millions of targets around the country of very, very different valuations. So this means that sort of the weakest link hypothesis does not hold. We shouldn't necessarily be going around hardening strip malls and bus stations if we don't think that they are attractive targets. So some highly vulnerable targets may be left largely undefended if we think they're of little interest to the attackers. So there is math behind this, but again, I'm not showing the equations. This is again a paper that was published in Risk Analysis about 10 years ago, sorry. This shows proposed funding allocations, optimal funding allocations to the top 10 UASI cities in the Urban Area Security Initiative. And you can kind of see from this picture, at the left, the x-axis is the cost effectiveness of our defenses, and the y-axis shows budget allocation. So at the left, if our defenses are not very cost effective, then we should maybe be giving all of our funding to New York, or maybe just New York and Chicago, because even if they get a sizable amount of funding, they will still remain more attractive than other targets. As we move to the right of the picture and our funding becomes more cost effective, we can afford to defend a larger number of targets and divide our allocation much more equally. So you see the targets here are New York, Chicago, Washington, San Francisco, and LA, Boston, and Philadelphia. And the top three, where it's too small to type the names, the pink, yellow, and blue, those are in some order: Houston, Newark, and Seattle, which are obviously all major cities and also have major ports, which is partially why they're considered attractive targets or potentially attractive targets. So this gives an illustration of the kind of results that can be achieved with game theory. And what do we learn from this? First, some caveats. The previous slide focused on the assumption that the defender wants to minimize expected property loss, and the attacker wants to maximize property loss plus an error term reflecting our uncertainty about their goals. But other objective functions would lead to different resource allocations. So for example, if we assume that the attacker wants to disrupt our aviation system, then at that point, O'Hare Airport is a logical choice of somewhere to attack. And under that assumption, Chicago would merit more funding and New York substantially less funding if there isn't a single major airport there that would seriously disrupt the whole US aviation system. Also note that even if some cities get no resources in a city level analysis, so for example, if our defensive investment is not cost effective enough to reach down to Seattle and Newark, those cities may still have targets that would be considered worth defending in a target level analysis. And this is actually consistent with how the UASI mechanism, the Urban Area Security Initiatives, functions in more recent years. So currently, 11 of the highest risk jurisdictions, the 10 that I showed, plus Dallas is now included in that list, receive about 85 or 86% of the UASI funding. And the remaining 15 or 20 urban areas that are eligible for UASI compete only for the remaining 14% of the funds. So they can get DHS money, but the funding levels are much smaller, say 3 million compared to 20 million or more going to the larger cities that are more risk-based. And I would say that the UASI funding mechanism doesn't formally use game theory at this point, but it is roughly consistent with the kinds of outcomes we would expect or funding allocations we would expect if they did use game theory. So DHS has kind of gotten on board with more risk-based preparedness in the UASI program as an example. What else can we learn from the kinds of results shown on that earlier slide? First of all, as we saw, optimal investment strategies depend critically on the cost effectiveness of our investment. If our investment is highly cost effective, then we can afford to spend money on defense of less valuable targets. At low cost effectiveness, we should be focusing most of our resources on the most valuable targets. Unfortunately, however, we currently have no good way to measure the cost effectiveness of our investment. If we give New York $20 million, does that make them 20% safer, 2% safer, 0.002% safer? At present, we really have no idea. And actually, the data that would allow at least a rough estimate of cost effectiveness, there is that kind of data available, but it's not owned by DHS, it's owned by the various jurisdictions, and so it's very difficult to get access to that kind of data to do this type of assessment. Another insight into this, we can see from the ideas of game theory that if every target makes its own funding decisions, some targets will receive too much resources and deflect risk onto other targets. So for example, if after the anthrax attacks in 2001, the Postal Service had put in anthrax protection equipment, that might just deflect risk onto private carriers like Federal Express or DHL or whoever, and not necessarily make the world safer, but just transfer risk to other organizations. Similarly, if we spend too much money on aviation security, we may deflect risk to the subway system or bridges or whatever else. So ideally, we would like to have more centralized decision-making, but even decisions by a single agency can look decentralized because of the kinds of pork barrel processes that we talked about at the beginning of the talk. You don't get officials from small cities and states going to DHS saying, we don't need money. So there is kind of a constant pressure to fund less important targets and a need to kind of push back against that to make sure that the most important targets are getting the funding they need. With large numbers of targets, another insight from game theory is that it's essentially hopeless to defend large numbers of targets individually. It makes sense to invest in target protection only if we can identify a relatively small number of targets that we think are at the most risk and agree that the remainder are relatively unlikely to be attacked and so will not be defended. The difficulty of defending large numbers of targets also suggests that public risk perception plays an important role. If the public demands protection against any possible terrorist attack, then we could bankrupt our economy by trying to protect huge numbers of targets. So a successful defense strategy also needs to focus on public perception and be able to explain to the public that DHS or state and local agencies are focusing their resources on the most serious risks, but not trying to protect against everything. I'm going to issue some quick conclusions, but then move on to talk about some of the more recent and ongoing areas of research. So the overall summary is that when facing the threat of an intentional attack, it is important to model the behavior of the attacker. For example, concentrating on transportation security may be effective if we think that the attacker also wants to focus on transportation attacks, but would be of little use if the attacker switches to, say, trying to contaminate our food supply, for example. Moving on to talk about what is difficult in risk-based security. An effective terrorism defense involves hard choices about which assets not to protect, some investment in overarching protections like border security and intelligence, or changes in the incentives faced by terrorists to deter or discourage terrorism in the first place. And these issues create some challenges for security research. So, talking about research directions, I'm going to focus on not so much the incremental analyses, which added features can we put into our models to make them more realistic, but in the spirit of looking where we lost our keys, what are the big challenges that we should be addressing, not the incremental improvements that are easy to add to the current models. So one challenge is to reframe the problem. So if target protection is hopeless when dealing with really large numbers of targets, this says that maybe we should be investing more in overarching protections that don't require us to guess right about which targets the attacker is interested in. So examples of those kinds of overarching protections are things like border security, public health, emergency response, intelligence services, etc. Bruce Hoffman of the RAND Corporation has also talked about the importance of reducing terrorist recruitment. So if we really are going to reframe the problem and come up with new ways of thinking about homeland security, maybe one thing we should be doing is funding secular madrasas in Pakistan and the Middle East so that poor children in need of education have some place to go where they will not be indoctrinated into sort of terrorist-oriented ideologies. Another issue is getting more realistic terrorist objective functions. Even the current models, like you saw, tend to be somewhat textbook or story problem oriented. Like assume that the bad guy wants to maximize economic damage and we want to minimize economic damage. This diminishes both the realism of these models and their credibility with decision makers and intelligence experts. There are some people who are doing very interesting work in this area. Richard Jonna Create is one. Greg Keeney and Detlev von Winterfeld have a paper in risk analysis in 2010. Igor Linkoff and Jeff Kiesler have a 2016 paper looking at multiple attribute decision making. So we are starting to get to more realistic models, but still not necessarily there yet. Another issue is that our current models tend not to distinguish carrots from sticks in responding to terrorism. So an example of a stick is our attack against Afghanistan after the September 11th terrorist attacks. And you can understand that this might have very different, cause very different reactions than, say, positive incentives that give extra resources to countries that crack down on internal terrorism, for example. At the start of the Cold War, we were really unsure how to think about nuclear deterrence. The resulting game theoretic model of mutual assured deterrence led to a Nobel Prize. And I think in many ways we are at a similar stage now to where we were at the start of the Cold War, where we really don't have good models for terrorism and counterterrorism, the same way we used to not have good models for nuclear deterrence. And so I think there's a lot of room to look at the relative merits of carrots and sticks. I have one paper that just is starting to tackle that issue, but again, I think there's a lot of room for more work on that. We also need better bridges to the intelligence community, and that requires two different kinds of changes. One is that in the risk analysis world, we need to get more realistic and credible in our models, more realistic multi-attribute terrorist objectives, more credible assumptions about attacker capability, etc. But I think the intelligence world also has a way to go to become more risk-based in a sense. Currently, the intelligence community relies quite heavily on the idea of consensus, which, as we in risk analysis know, is not necessarily a great mechanism for dealing with uncertainty and the wide range of opinions that might be out there about terrorism. And so I think there is a lot of room for the intelligence world to improve its analyses by using risk analysis and decision analysis to better inform intelligence judgments in the face of uncertainty. So with that, I will give some acknowledgments. First of all, this work was supported mostly by Department of Homeland Security, and I've also worked with a lot of great students and colleagues and relied on the work of other researchers, too numerous to mention. And of course, the opinions and any errors or misstatements are mine, not theirs. I think with that, I am happy to take questions if there are some. So I would encourage people to type in your questions. I think we still have about 10 minutes to deal with questions and answers.
We do, and thank you, Vicki. That was fantastic. We don't have any questions yet, but I know that people tend to start typing them right about now. So I'll stall for a minute while people type questions if they have them, and remind people to go to the SRA website where you'll be able to see this webinar if you came in the middle. I saw some folks joining in the middle. And you can also see all of our past webinars. So every webinar we've put on is recorded as a video and is loaded up there on the website. So you can go and do that. And you can also look for information about our upcoming meeting in December 8th through 12th in Arlington, Virginia, which is just in the DC area. Okay, let's see if we have any questions here. I don't see any yet.
Also, I would add that I'm easy to find on email, and so if you think of something a week from now, or you really want to get copies of some of the papers or whatever, people are welcome to email me after the webinar as well.
Okay. Oh, here we go. Questions are rolling in. Okay, so the first one says, and this is from Julia Coxon. It says, can you talk a little bit about some other domains where you think some of this analysis could be applied?
I'm not sure whether other domains means other terrorism domains. I know, for instance, there is a lot of interest in cybersecurity, but I think cybersecurity is even harder than traditional homeland security. But also, game theory is being used more widely outside of just security. Back in the dark ages when I was in grad school, at that time, game theory was considered kind of a cute toy. Like, it was something fun for mathematically oriented people to play with, but it wouldn't see much application. But now, for instance, if you're interested in electricity pricing in the Enron disaster in California, game theory can be used to discuss the market power of players in markets that are thin, that are not fully competitive because there's too few suppliers. Game theory can be used for online auctions. If you have bots that are out trying to buy resistors or capacitors or whatever at low cost for your company, the buyers and sellers can be modeled by game theory, etc. So yes, there are other applications beyond terrorism as well.
Well, this next question is right along those same lines, and so it's probably already answered, but it said, this one's from Elizabeth Alves, and it says, I was wondering if game theory can be applied to deal with fuel theft from pipelines.
I haven't seen examples of that in particular, but yes, I would say that pipelines are just inherently a hard problem because of game theory. That if you think about, a thief could go to a very remote area and may be impractical to protect all of those locations. So I don't know that game theory has any good solutions to that problem. It can maybe just help understand the problem.
Yeah. Okay, good question, good answer. The next one is from Carl Dister, and it says, thanks for a great presentation. Have you seen any good models for insider threats in organizations, for example, cultural organizational models?
So I haven't really looked at the insider threat problem very much. And there may be work that I'm not aware of. The only thing that I am remembering from many years ago, which is probably still used, is the kind of, red teaming or black hat, white hat models where, for example, you could hire security experts and give them varying levels of access. So as an outsider, what would be your top 3 or top 5 attack strategies? Then what are your top attack strategies if you have the password to this system, or if you have a collaborator who works at the guard booth, or etc. And so I think a lot of those insider threats are addressed through red teaming, but I don't know beyond that what else has been done in that area.
Okay, great. Our next question is from Gaida Atu, and it says, hi, Vicky, thank you for your presentation. What is your email address?
Excellent question. My email is beer, B as in boy, IER, at ENGR, like engineering, .wisc for Wisconsin.edu. But again, if you just Google Vicky Beer, there aren't too many people with my name out there, so I think you'll find it online also.
Great. The next question is from Justin Pence. It says, I'm curious about why the emphasis in your talk was on risk-based and not risk-informed. For example, the risk-informed framework found in the nuclear industry. Can you speak to the differences between these two with respect to security?
Sure, that's a really interesting question, and I have my own view, which other people might not share. I think the terminology risk-informed in the nuclear industry means very similar to what risk-based means in other industries. And I think the terminology was kind of a semantic way of dealing with resistance. So when risk analysis first came into the nuclear industry, there were people both in industry and at the Nuclear Regulatory Commission who were resistant and said, how can you expect me to make decisions based only on the results of a risk analysis? That would be insane. And so the proponents of risk analysis said, oh, no, 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 that would be risk-based decision-making. We believe in risk-informed decision-making, where risk analysis is only one of the tools brought to bear. And so I think most other industries just never went through that same conversation. And, you know, when I say risk-based, I really mean, again, that risk analysis would be only one of the tools brought to bear, not that I would expect DHS to look at the results of my paper and decide how to allocate funding according to those computer printouts or whatever. So I think the transition from risk-based to risk-informed in the nuclear industry was really just kind of a semantic change, and that in most industries, what people mean by risk-based is similar to what the nuclear industry means by risk-informed. But again, that's just my own perspective. So
Justin just sent in a response to your response that says, awesome, thanks.
Oh.
So we have one more question and a statement. So the next question is from a second question from Julia Coxon. So she says, in context of reliability methods, do you have any thoughts on the concepts of resilience engineering, mindfulness and the preoccupation of failure, etc., and how it applies to terrorism risk analysis?
Sure. I think that resilience mindset is important. And I probably haven't thought enough about how it applies, but I can give you one very good example. At one point, I was on an EPA panel looking at security for water systems. And the panel was heavily focused on very high-tech methods that could detect like tiny amounts of contamination introduced into a water system, et cetera. And of course, therefore, very expensive. And so, yes, if I'm running the water system for New York City, I might want that kind of technology. I don't know whether they have done that or not, but you could imagine that the New York City or DC water systems might want that. But there are thousands of water systems around the country, some of which are tiny and support only a very small community of maybe a few thousand people in a rural area. Even if you assume that the terrorists are indifferent between attacking a large water system and a small water system, the small systems are protected by their numbers, even if they are not undesirable targets inherently. And so if I think about what should be happening at a small water system, it's very much in line with that kind of resilience mindset. That, gee, maybe a couple times a year, the manager should bring all the workers together and say, you know, hey, if you see something, say something. If you see somebody coming by with a 55-gallon drum and backing up towards the reservoir, call the police or call somebody and let them know that this is happening. And that might be a totally adequate level of protection for a small water system. And you can imagine, you know, similarly for small communities that are not at high risk. I think that resilience mindset is low cost to implement, shall we say, and therefore definitely does have a part to play in security.
Excellent. So our timing is perfect. We're right at the top of the hour. The last comment was a comment, not a question. It's from Mary O'Reilly, who says, "Great presentation. Thank you." And so I'll echo that, and thank you, Vicki, for putting all this together and giving us this webinar. It's fantastic, and it'll be on the website as a video by the end of the week.
Awesome. And again, people are welcome to email me later for additional questions or copies of papers, etc.
Great. Thank you, everybody. Thanks for joining.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.